Hello, black pupils. Hear your name be taught. Boxing is fought, but by the rules, but they abridged. See white survives, attend, deciphers, to answer questions here. So Jeffrey Sachs is obviously an intelligent man, an expert on different types of things relied on internationally. And see, but names A through Z, even if as bodies as majorities of people, even if as bodies as majorities of countries, all voicings they're gonna have, no, they're gonna have you as value even if they don't use the word humanity. In a breaching method from semi ancient times, demonstrably measured and maintained, it knew such and how it could exploit such, with where and how it was exploiting things that we could observe, but we missed because of differences. In other words, there are all kinds of things that this breaching method employed to be blamed on other things, to be blamed on others, or other, and or on selves, and or for that to be sensed, per how it employed. Before our founders were even born in America, in Russia, in Israel, in Ukraine, in China, before our country's founders were even born, our modern country's founders, already names A through Z of the human volume science, without realizing they'd been forced, tricked, hurt, and persuaded to have to react to things using as value, not even if they don't use the phrase, criminally foreign influence. And nature showing also the need for them to use the phrase, which had never been before, but nature shows us it manifests hyper criminally foreign influenced. And this is also not only non distinctly against countries A through Z, it is also sickly non distinctly against them. So it's right there too. That's also positive because that shows us where and how we all agree. And with the subject treatment being led by nature itself, it has uses of groupings. We have the same color eyes. We have different color eyes at the same time. And then there are exceptions in exception nature being demonstrating. What also comes with this is the ability to discern the identity of hyper-simultaneous, that is appreciation of what is constant and what is variable in the ways we know, but also ways simultaneously greater than, more finite than, and with active relativity to ourselves, where and how it is not ourselves, but it is to an extent. And it can't be completely, but it is anyway. And this is how this is how we are hyper additional nature. So there are things I've said calmly, for example, and there are things I and others say calmly, anyone, calmly or aggressively. And what they missed, people A through Z, since you were kids. At three, there are multi-front maintenance to collusions between with and as self-valued roles. For example, with 15 distinct identity of the ground, identity of relationship to itself that are manifest, where and how we are a trinity, for example, where and how it is observable, where and how we are hyper additional nature. So Jeffrey Sachs is associated with the Columbia University, which has a lot of experts associated, for example, with the environment. And this is the American history, Russian history, Ukrainian history, Chinese history. We know Native American history. We know things that, as in the difference between how we know it as a Native American or a non-Native American. I'm not Native American, but I am their species volume to know that and to be able to discern nature demonstrating the value of indigenous populations, because sickly distinctly their difference is being and having been employed by a breaching method that our founders also communicated other than what is being and has been communicated for them. For example, per this being, I'm not a lawyer, but it is a hyper predicate acts with facts delivery system method. And or the difference of that and or a criminal insidiousness nature delivery system method. As collusions plural, to increasingly screen a hyper foreign that also better than very easily maintained since semi-ancient times, since before modern religious messengers came about, the sciences, all formal order, tactical ulterior from how nature is the formal. In other words, needing to pretend other, showing how to speak, as a certain type of victim / hyper victim. And distinctly right to left as a hyper victim / victim, because the difference of that too, we could have discerned with subject treatments. There is hyper evidential that can be used. So it is hyper evidential that if you look at fish, the eyes of fish, they have quality aspects in nature that is distinct from our own eyes, humanities, but they're also non-distinct. And we know this. We know the birds, they have eggs, but they have male, female, species volume. We know that there are natures of debates between people. So we left out how this breaching method used the nature of debate to screen its roles with where and how it employed clearer than day. Other things, others, or selves, blamed for things it causes and keeps. So there is what recently in a video that was on, I don't know if Fox News, CNN, MSNBC covered it, but there's a Tucker Carlson who I did a video on it. But he had a recent interview with Vladimir Putin, who used the phrase bourgeoisie, which is where, like, for example, and in the link I have in this video here, this live stream, this YouTube live stream, YouTubers, we could free the world, we could liberate the world. See, but we have to force equality. We have, the mandated law has been read wrong, because a certain type of victim / hyper victim, it knew with sense as rolls with sustained criminally foreign influence uses / hyper criminally foreign influence uses also used singularly in ways that we could discern hyper-evidentially. For example, how the North and the South, before our founders were even born, more than 13 colonies divided themselves, not just the ways on paper. Our founders' plan with James Madison as the face of our founders and George Washington as our first president, the agreement he had with that plan of James Madison as our first founder, that is being and has been replaced, and rolls with the nature of debate in readings of statutes that give and gave the benefit of the doubt to identities of logic experts. They have been using a truth for a lie, for example, on a mass scale, while being and having been used remotely so they could deny that as collusions with worse. Being and having been involved also so long, it has all natures of investigations, investigators, all natures of voices, A through Z, individually grouped and together, recorded clearer than day, many ways to discern this with appreciation of the hyper-evidential. This is a method of hyper-programming possible here. See, but the lead up to each of the sciences, being and having been abridged and pretending other, this is a nature of experts lean, individually grouped and together. So these people say, well, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not, in other words, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not one who's also a doctor of mental health. They're making things up in databases where and how, for example, recorded clearer than day. The World Trade Center and countries and other countries' equivalents. In other words, they pretend on a mass scale. The real causes of the worst negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures, and all negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures. The causes of them, especially the most serious ones, they require the most serious answers, answer/S. And see, that has always left out the seriousness of the breaching method that was entrenched sickly distinctly north and south. For example, with color and with slavery and with roles, using it to measure and maintain collusion, not with just with this or that, not that or not, the difference of that. Collusion with the use of location/S. That is use of difference/S. That can't defend its short words, let alone the protraction of them, without self-valuing this having been, without self-valuing a certain type of victim/hyper-victim at each age and nature of campuses. Now, there are medical campuses. Hospitals are also campuses. And there are fire campuses. Fire departments are also fire campuses. And the Republic came with a campuses system that we could observe was inherited having been criminally foreign influenced. And then that left out with descriptions of its how it fell, and where and how it didn't, where and how it is manifest as a whole bunch of individual republics. Now uses of systems tactical ulterior from that which is hyper native pure. So there are things that are not debatable that nature shows us as the human volume science. There is a human fact treatment nature breaching method against and using difference and having used differences. And this is manifest where people are describing names and serious things like environmental problems. It is inseparable from where and how they got away. People A through Z, otherwise you're sensed, with pretending not to realize that all you have to do is see a picture from a distance of any suburb or let alone cities, let alone New York City. This breaching method had set up, already used remotely, all voicings as groupings of humanity. All truths for that caused negative value, nature progressions, acts, and nature's demonstrations of it. One cannot address the nature's environmental problems honestly without having American history liberated, which simultaneously liberates Russian history telling, which simultaneously liberates China's history telling, Ukraine's. Before our modern country's names, leaders were born. Already to become a country, they were forced, tricked, hurt, and persuaded to value international relations and simultaneously independence as names already having been used. Tactical ulterior from how the ancients were shown by in our how we're being shown by nature. What was those demonstrations? They are prevented through the filters of people with exceptions and exception nature denial, where there are subject treatments. So, for example, both political parties, this employed at countries A through Z uses of the difference between republic, democracy, and exceptions in exception nature. For example, manifest as isms uses and treatments with logic. In other words, A therefore B. And constantly exceptions in exception nature as systems tactical ulterior from the one that uses functionally. How we can discern if the smallest finite details are being left out, grouped ones simultaneously, and simultaneous ones, where the hyper simultaneous being distinct from the simultaneous is one of the ways we could discern. It is because there is a scientific value when there are hyper evidential demonstrations, plural, of one identity of hyper relativity, its identity of relationship to itself, and the only increasing value of that per science that begins with and stays with the discernment of the hyper simultaneous being one of the things nature shows us to discern it as, because being an individual, for example, is being simultaneous relativity to the species volume while being a sequence relativity to it. And all group difference slash S is really what the plural part is about. Differences are about this hyper difference, hyper relativity. See, this breaching method measures and maintains what it already measured and maintained, associated with all natures of readings of precedents and statutes. As formal readers and writers of the law and participants, and or as regular people speaking with logic. So in other words, Nature shows us also three ways: simultaneously, distinctly, non-distinctly, and simultaneously and further hyper-simultaneously, because of how it shows. How it is functional, being positive and being distinct identities of power that can be simultaneously positive or not. Clearer than day, what is hyper evidentially recorded is where and how this breaching method backed a bunch of victims slash hyper victims already having been sustained in this breaching method, where and how simultaneously, just like before our founders were even born in America, northern states and southern, when they were colonies, sickly distinctly, they were crazy. There were possessions of the sense and sensibilities over people relative to questions. All investigations of investigators and or their nature and descriptions were used, where and how there were the agreements and the fights and the differences of that too, between France, Spain, England, with the North and South. Their differences too. See, people speak to this day about such. People want to have nature of debate. That leaves out the value of what came first. That leaves out the value of why and how. We were told to have understood clearly James Madison as the face of our founders, plural. And then that first. And then they got George Washington to agree with his plan, with their plan in the face of James Madison. And that plan was us to direct it to get to the point where we could have free speech, to tell honestly, telling no lies. Therefore, not valuing truths used for lies by the speaker or by others. Because through this is screening itself. That which is hyper extraterritorial. Everywhere the species body is, at locations A through Z. We can make all these negatives into hyper positives, and or have it as a method in nature of it, and as simultaneously be, we have to be a nature and identity of awareness of how this has not been, because how it has been exploited. Our countries were shared here before our founders were born. Right where the breaching method would measure and maintain collusion /S. It had extortion not just against individual countries, but of them grouped. All locations, areas, and states, everywhere the species body is. It had other things, others, and ourselves, blamed for negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures that contain demonstration /S of the breaching method, but they are in demonstration of how names A through Z are being used as systems, individually grouped and together. Tactical ulterior from the hyper-native system. People are making things complicated and simultaneously simple, tactical ulterior from how nature does. For example, where and how it keeps it functional, how the hyper simultaneous /simultaneous, and how the simultaneous /hyper simultaneous is the same identity. It's distinct, non-distinct, and hyper simultaneous identity relationship to itself is discernible how it is distinct, non-distinct, simultaneous / hyper-simultaneous. And we'll examine this on paper, but the lead up to it and descriptions of names are being used to screen where and how they are building upon and have built upon fake things typed in databases at each of our campuses. And they have measured and maintained a breaching method did. Conscious uses. For example, they pretend that, and they believe with delusions, people when they know that states and federal agencies have rights and needs to keep secrets. They left and leave out in self-value, as the breaching method knew they would. How those secrets were imposed with precedents and statute readings with differences uses as collusion. As collusion is plural with the singular breaching method, which has maintained singular same way since before founding, but before computers. Our names were relative to databases and relative to a nature of a republic that became criminally foreign influenced, but had first been demonstrated to by nature itself how properly to counter things like criminal insidiousness, let alone hyper-criminal insidiousness, and or use /s of the difference /s. There are black themed and our KKK themed military police who are also used remotely where America had and has. Thank God. Unity with and independence from simultaneously. Still, names A through Z. Like with Kuwait before the Iraq War, because their roles also on off the World Trade Center, on off the Ninth Circuit Court next to it. The day of the attack, the night before it, other ways short term, as names also long term leading up to it. The World Trade Center is tied to natures of trade. And that where and how, relative to where and to how this breaching method employed use of names. And then Hitler's name used. No, not apart from this. People want and need to pretend that the right to free speech, the right to the, in other words, there are collusions with through our sides. And they are doing this into religious spots too. And the people that counter them collusions because of where and how they get away with blaming other things, others, or selves, exactly with the breaching method employed for negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures, increasingly in demonstration of the breaching method. It effectively employed them in more names and hyper additional motivations, natures, needs, interests to be apparent, including as effective uses of the kids of overt criminal enterprises, private ones. All the difference of all the different countries shared on and off the campuses as they actually are. And so they're directed to hide that here and there. Otherwise, they are hurt as a group body. This is how we have left out the group voicings, the communication with nature, how nature communicates about communication, which is the identity of what is said. But it is also simultaneously greater than, more finite than, and with active relativity to what is said. And or no, it is the value of what came first. Because it is also the only identity that could lead questions properly. And or have exceptions in exception nature. Demonstrate that if there's a mistake. There is no mistake with the humanity A through Z, we want to make convictions regarding nuclear weapons, regarding how we know the suburbs were designed before our founders were born. And in other words, and that was for the torture, extortion, slavery method of everyone. And they had to pretend other, or they were sensed and they were hurt, even if they were majority of people. They had, in other words, so even if they were made up completely, and regardless of who made them up or why, which trials were about that fact. It also employed collusion / criminal enterprises, private ones, that it maintained, it propagated, only capable of being, only allowed to be. And then where it was propagated, self-cultivated, other things, others or selves, blamed for what the breaching method caused. A breaching method was and is a scientific value that is greater than and more finite than is active relativity, true all ways, as what caused World War I and World War II, as what caused the Civil War. One can't understand the Civil War because through our campuses still are maintained collusions with the hyper-criminally foreign influenced, are maintained collusions with the illusions of difference / S, exactly how they were employed to measure and maintain. For example, people aren't supposed to change what people say. Not supposed to value when they say simple facts. Connecticut interbranch switched names. Their roles were off campuses. The other political and their sources. That's what came before courts. They've been putting fake transcripts in databases. They've been building upon faked audio and video on campuses, including ones filmed 24/7. They never stopped being used from other locations. They never stopped needing live progressions, needed recorded employments of all formal identities of voices for the sciences. Therefore, the names of the sciences simultaneously, distinctly, non-distinctly, and simultaneously hyper simultaneously, because again of the significance of this hyper volume, it's hyper native too. That's why and how it shows the value of indigenous populations are to discern all systems individually grouped in together, all uses of differences formal, used as systems tactical terror from its own. So this causes and kept negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures, where new healthy people would end up hurt and or killed at hospitals. For example, identities of locations where it could measure and maintain exploitation, right where we agree, our human volume, our great, where everyone's great, we agree there's the great people there. Now, the mental health side and the lawyers and the policing of it, that never stopped being, and the judges, courts with it, and names on off state judicial branch offices, on off state corrections offices in Wethersfield, Connecticut. They never stopped being collusion / S with that which George Washington had to counter extort, but leave entrenched. Sickly distinctly north and south again, out of nowhere having been forced to be a side where they weren't even aside then. And they forced at 13 strategic locations that became the first 13 states, as we could demonstrate, other than how they were forced to pretend they came together one way on paper, but they left us means to correlate and to explain how the real reason they came together was you have to understand the plan between James Madison and George Washington, how he agreed to it. They went out and found George Washington. He didn't find them. He was already extorted. He was already factory nature enslaved, and or that would be sensed. This is a syntactical possession of names A through Z everywhere the species body is. Roles with a difference between the overt criminal enterprises, private ones, the three branches of government at the same time, the exceptions tied to them, the private, the prisons, the differences between that. They already had predicate acts with facts roles. Forgiveness is because they're denials of that. And or they're just speaking anyway in their tactical delusions. They were sustained collusions with a whole bunch of different methods and natures of organized crime. Crimes, plural. Again, you hyper additionally only capable of being per this method that needs increasingly other things, others, or selves. Blamed for what nature is showing and has shown. So descriptions of American history have been roles with uses of truths for lies, and to screen and exceptions used to screen that by others used for lies. So in other words, and needing to pretend how they get away with the nature of debate, assignments of the value of voting, pretended to being what it doesn't, while still rolls with criminally foreign influence. Prevention of mandated law under the guise of being for it or having been for it. And this is how they do it sickly distinctly. At each campus, there are vertical and horizontal confessions manifest as the breaching method knew it would, because the breaching method understands hypercommunication, how nature communicates. Nature shows us to appreciate this word, its identity of hyperrelativity, as its identity of relativity to positive and negative, because it uses the difference of those powers, those distinct identities. Time is an individual forever nature, where is 5 distinct identities of relativity, like just like cell body, cell nucleus, cell wall. Come also with the discernment of the appreciation of gases and of water and its elements with cells under a microscope. For example, with where and how English was revealed in appreciation of the hyper invisible but still discernible. It is why and how the participle natures, their complete identity, no matter which one is used. Everything is about this identity of forever nature, which is one of the things hyper additionally constantly the hyper invisible but still discernible is. That one identity of hyper simultaneous that comes with all the invisible but still discernible parts of speech, of languages, plural, of language /s, and of languages / language, individually grouped in together the same way. All differences are in demonstration of the hyperdifference. All parts of your body have a semi-nature relationship to your complete identity. Your complete identity, 3 ways, has relativity to the species volume and to it's a complete identity relationship to itself, which is distinct from its semi-nature relationship to itself, which is great, which is hyper-additional. It is making more of itself through temporary space nature. So it is important to note how we have black pupils, whites of eyes. They're the same color eyes, different color eyes at the same time. And nature is capable of discerning the hyper-invisible, but still discernible. Distinctly from the invisible, but still discernible. And this is increasingly relative. Because another one of the things I noted for hyper-evidential proofs, for example, I forgot, but one of the things too is things people say clearly and things they don't say clearly. And the difference of that, is exploited per where and how, sickly distinctly. The differences between overt criminal enterprises and private ones, that the breaching method propagated only capable of being therefore. Before our founders were born, they were still entrenched. Now these are voicings. These are natures. This is relative to where and to how people get away with having nature debate that so overtly contains criminally foreign influence, factor, nature, quality aspects in nature as criminal insidiousness. And nature itself shows us to discern / criminal insidiousness. There was a hyper foreign body that forced, tricked, hurt, and persuaded names A through Z and groupings. Now they're going to make voicings, whether they use the word humanity or not. This breaching method is measuring and maintaining. People speaking for such values. People usually speaking for differences, like with economic values. Not legitimate. People spoke about that and security at the same time. The people who run the prisons of New York City, sickly distinctly from the people who run the off the state Connecticut corrections offices. They have roles of former director of the FBI, Robert Luskin, with spots next to it too, through time, involved with identity theft, frauds, and slanders, increasingly intercampuses connected, where they're putting fake things in databases at campuses, and everyone's missing it because it's done against everyone. Because clearer than day, multi-front at everywhere the species body has a body is maintenance to how it propagated other things others are self-cultivated. Instead, nature's demonstration of it blamed on other things others are selves. In other words, other was communicated for James Madison as the face of our founders before and as the plan that George Washington, they went out to seek George Washington to do this. And he agreed to it. And see, but they had to hide their roles with this actual. And everyone had to hide their actual motivations, because the breach method assigned that a whole bunch of different ways at once, too. So it could measure and maintain from abroad and or through its roles with countries A through Z. through our own, used remotely. See, they prevent mandated law. They pretend we have to sue for things, for rights, where and how the courts or the exceptions tied to them, even like people next to the state prison offices, state judicial offices, next to the homes of friends of theirs. He said, she said, and the experts on it or the people that go before them. The difference of that. This maintained originally still them collusions, communicating other for themselves and others. And there are means to discern this. In other words, on a mass scale, they painted themselves into corners as the breaching method knew they would. People A through Z, all groupings. So what we could do is have the countries, nature shows us, even if they made, you have to be able to use this method of discernment too. Being led by the hyper invisible, but still discernible. So even if witch trials were made up, they were and are still recorded involved with the breaching method roles, recorded certain type of victim / hyper victim that also pretends we're attacking them when we bring them up, when they brought themselves up, including how the witch trial place is mixed with descriptions of how George Washington had to come to Wethersfield, Connecticut, right before the last battle of the Revolutionary War. And right next to the witch trials place. No, one can't understand this. This is the last of the 13 counter-extorted locations. And then once you counter-extorted, and once you break those syntactical or names, inclusions, or speak the wrong sense and sensibilities, they would be sensed through our own, or through the, in other words, as our own being names A through Z anywhere the species body is. And pretending other is going to self-value what? All those definitions and perceptions of only having heard, different differences, black, white, the colonists, the things, So the counters to crazy laws are entertaining criminally foreign influence, fact, treatment, nature, quality aspects of themselves as shock and awe, no. And then it knew, and this breaching method /S knew what all victims / hyper victims did wrong for itself in the past. And it measures and maintains the science of keeping other things, others, ourselves blamed. And uses of self-value, criminally foreign influence, precedents, and statutes formal as informal collusions. So increasingly we have people who don't even understand themselves as the people who know more about this than ourselves, as a how they have all these different hundreds of countries shared here and there. It is relative to where and to how they're so. We have to let the hyper invisible but still discernible lead, because everyone has there are rights for everyone, needs for everyone to use other people's names wrongly. That's being forced. It's per this how you guys are preventing this at each age of fact TV nature through names that have been roles with all these different countries in the news where they can't afford to have discerned. Where that was a part with them with uses of flags too. No. Evidences, crimes, methods that are confessions where they make. One of the things that our countries A through Z do is proof. We'll make a theory because you guys don't want to follow what is proper that would show that there are uses of theories or like words like theories that can't defend that and afford to have discern what is proper with short words, let alone their protraction. Black pupils. There was a predicate acts with facts delivery system method that Al had self-valued roles with, not realizing where and how and what this breaching method uses. And they can't fathom how. All natures of investigations, investigators in their campuses, their homes, next to their home. All natures of difference, Black pupils. Look at the crazy laws they had. They were equivalent to factory nature slavery against everyone sickly distinctly. To measure and maintain functional. Anybody capable, even if it's a majority of people, it's everyone together, of confronting that, only capable of blaming other things other than themselves, not the hyper-foreign. Even if it was only by accident, that this is the pattern from some ancient time since before modern religions messengers were born. The sciences had already been demonstrably criminally foreign influence demonstrations of uses of their names, because their sciences share an identity, Black pupils. Boxing, martial arts, and wrestling. And everything is about the one identity of hyper-positive that will and can only stay positive unto itself. All exceptions in exception nature that appear to be in demonstration of other. That and or others that are negative. They're in demonstration the same thing, but also with a special difference. Had we appreciated special difference too, simultaneously with truth, with the relativity of how the suburbs were tactically denatured, involved with the torture, extortion, and slavery of our founders, and of per their roles with the plan of James Madison, again, and then with the agreement of George Washington. He didn't have to agree. He could have said, "Okay, we'll get someone else to lead, or I'll agree, but I'm not going to be the first president." In other words, in other words, this is what we were told. We were told he agreed. He was the one that they got, and he agreed. That agreed to be our first president, distinctly from our first founders. See, the nature of debate regarding this, the breaching method deciphered what our founders communicated to us, which again was greater than, more finite than, an act of relativity to what they said. Again, and so we have the appreciation. The reason things are classified is because they have legal agreements that they're supposed to hide how they have shared. Central Connecticut State University is leaking with other countries. They're demonstrating. They have roles with criminal justice and with names intercities who've been planting on-off child campuses, including with proven child defenders, leaders of kids. Roles with conscious uses of tactically juxtaposed, tactically distinct natures of organized crime and of abuses of each age of factory nature right through the same connected names. On-off child campuses, abuses of them. On-off elderly homes, veterans' homes, abuses of them. On-off the programs that are the only help of elderly, abuses of them. I don't know anything about Meals with Wheels. But all natures of and the exceptions, in other words, they have natures of business. We're supposed to leaving out, except they can't afford to have a demonstrate what's exceptions in exception nature. Our founders were forced to become a country. America never had wealth. And any wealth America has, for the most part, it's because of and as people who are individuals, a whole bunch of different countries. But in the end, the difference of that individually grouped and together, those are all voicings that are still being used to screen how they're attaching individuals to fake words at each age of factory nature. There are conscious assignments of descriptions of what is smart or wise as of people. In other words, for real, how smart little kids are in New York City. And when they're simultaneously wrong too, though, not in other words. In other words, there's fake sciences. That's correct. So they want to keep everyone blaming other things other than themselves for it. Thank you. Vaccines.